Everyone, my name is Shireen. Welcome to the General Judge Briefing for the Asian Parliamentary format. I'm also the CA for Malaysian Asian Parliamentary 2025, and the purpose of this briefing is to be a short yet comprehensive enough judge briefing to keep online as a resource for future tournaments or institutions if they need it for whatever purposes in mind. Again, it's going to be a short and fast briefing. If you require a more comprehensive explanation of any of the details mentioned, please refer to the UADC Judge Manual as the ultimate source of truth for the Asian parliamentary format. In general, deliberation time should be kept at a maximum of 15 minutes, including the initial vote cast. You should only discuss or deliberate your verdict with the other panel members after your votes have been cast, and you should not discuss before any votes are cast because you're not allowed to persuade the verdict of any other member. In the formal UADC format, each panelist will have to deliver an oral adjudication or an OA, but in most smaller tournaments, they usually keep it as just the chair due to logistical or time problems. And in the instance where the chair is rolled by the minority, or sorry, in the instance where the chair is in the minority and is rolled by other panelists, a member of the panel may opt to give the OA instead. For the interest of time, OAs should be kept at a maximum of 10 minutes as well, and should only articulate the verdict and not additional feedback for the debaters, which you can give afterwards, as we'll cover later as well. Filling in the ballot, quite simple. There are no low score wins in Asian parliamentary, meaning the team that wins the round should also have the higher total speaker scores combined in comparison to the other team. Constructive speeches are scored within the range of 67 to 83, and reply speeches are normally half of that. It's very important you score speeches correctly because they will affect the draw in the break rounds, and therefore you should refer to the full range of scale as per the manual when deciding the speaker scores for your speeches. Or your speakers, sorry. There are some general principles of judging as well you should abide to. The first being the ordinary intelligent voter. The ordinary intelligent voter is the position you take as a judge when assessing the overall rigor or logic that's being argued in the round. So the OIV regularly reads major international newspapers but has no specialist knowledge. So they know what's going on in the world, but they may not know the specifics or the details of why, how, etc. And it is the burden of teams to explain that thoroughly to you as an OIV. You are capable of understanding complex ideas if explained. Therefore, you should not arbitrarily accept assumptions or assertions in the round unless the teams do their job and explain it to you. But at the same time, you are an expert in the rules of debating, so you know how to point out or identify contradictions when you're tracking the speeches, etc. You should discount material that an OIV would not understand. So, for example, in the finance or an international relations round, if a team explains a fact dump that is making sense to an OIV, you can credit that. But if they just say supply demand graph without explaining what that means in the context of the debate, that's not something the ordinary intelligent voter would automatically understand, and therefore should be material you discredit. You are not swayed by appeals to emotion or authority unless it rationally influences you. And most importantly, you should not bring in your own expertise, knowledge, political bias, etc. into the debate to assess the rigor or weight of what the teams are saying. You are essentially a blank slate with the basic amount of fundamental knowledge that a ordinary person would have when assessing the round, and that's the position you ought to take when assessing the clashes of the round as well. Secondarily, contradictions. Contradictions are when a speaker takes a stance that is directly oppositional to a stance they previously took by themselves or by a speech previously said by one of their teammates. So, for example, if the first speaker says X is good and the second speaker says X is bad, that is a direct contradiction. Contradictions are not clearly mistakenly said statements, preemptive arguments, or a correction to a clear misspeak. Oftentimes, some judges might mistake a even if argument as a contradiction, whereas in most cases, it's not true. It is oftentimes just an additional bulk of material they're using to supplement their already existing analysis. In the event a true contradiction happens where a speaker just contradicts or knifes their stance, you only credit the first claim that was made and not the contradictory claim that was made secondarily. You can evaluate subjectively how far the contradiction affects the overall persuasiveness of the first claim or the overall rigor of the team's case, but you should not credit the other team for that contradiction unless they point it out and use it as material or refer to it in the overall engagement between those two teams. Thirdly, adjudication in Asian parliamentary is holistic, which means style of the speech and the analysis given in the speech are not separate. You ought to assess both collectively, and they both influence how persuasive a speech can be. I would also just want to note here that persuasion is oftentimes mistaken for flowery language or flamboyant use of vocabulary, whereas oftentimes it is also dependent on how rigorous your claims are, how logical your statements are, and how for example, in depth you go in terms of proving your claims. So it's not just the level of language or the fluency of English that determines persuasiveness. It is a collective assessment of all of the things that make a speech a good speech. Fourthly, equity. Quite briefly, you're not supposed to enforce the rules of equity yourself unless it's already superbly disrupting the flow of the round. You ought to just report the issues to the equity officer of the tournament and let them deal with that claim. And just because a team has violated the rules of equity does not mean they should automatically lose or be penalized. You ought to just assess the speech as it was. And if the claim that is violating the equity rules happens to also violate the persuasiveness or overall rigor of their case, you can assess that as it is, as opposed to as an equity violation. General points that you should also look at in the oral adjudication. So oral adjudications should encompass the key arguments and clashes in the round, ideally with reference to the material said in the speeches. So you are referring to the arguments made by LO, for example, and how they weighed up against what was made by the Prime Minister, and why you chose one version of the framing, one version of the analysis over the other, or why you weighed the LO's mechanisms over the Prime Minister's, for example. You're referring to what was said in the round as opposed to a general overview of one was more persuasive or one was a better proven argument than the other. Secondly, you ought to be as specific as you can be within the time frame that you're given. So you will explain how the argument on one side interacts or clashed against material on the other side, how teams weigh their claim, etc. Again, you're not being general to suggest I prefer the arguments made by government bench, or I think government bench did a better job. You are specifically explaining the interactions that happened in the debate and how you assess them in the overall figuring out of the verdict. Lastly, OAs should obviously have a clear enough structure. You only have about 10 minutes maximum to deliver your OA, sometimes less given the tournament schedule, and therefore you should structure it in a manner that provides a clearest overview of the debate as opposed to the nitty-gritty. So usually in most cases that I've personally seen, OAs have been structured based on clashes. So as opposed to going speaker by speaker or argument by argument, for example, the judge consolidates the material in the round into clashes and discusses those as opposed to the full length of mechanisms and arguments given by each speaker. So other structures are fine as well, as long as they're clear enough to provide a big picture overview of the debate, but at the same time, keeping within the 10-minute time frame that you have. And I don't know why that happened on the screen, but anyway, as long as it's within the time frame, it's clear enough, and it's specific enough to refer to material in the round, your structure is fine. Next up, OAs should not run beyond 10 minutes. One, because of logistical problems, you might delay the round in the tournament if you go over 10 minutes, but secondarily also, if it takes too long for you to explain the verdict, it might sometimes become too confusing or unclear to teams. And generally speaking, if you're able to summarize the material in the debate or the most critical aspects of the debate that were critical in you deciding the verdict into a 10-minute OA, that should be the sweet spot for teams to still catch what you're trying to explain. Secondly, you ought not be vague. So avoid general phrases like they won because they were more persuasive or they lost because they didn't do a good job. You need to explain why they didn't do a good job or why an argument you thought was not persuasive enough, or contrarily, why you thought an argument was persuasive enough, why a rebuttal did do a good job in defeating the other team's claim, etc. So again, referring to what you should do, it's explaining interactions as opposed to commenting on whether teams did a good job or not. Lastly, always should also not describe what teams could have done better or what arguments could have been added or omitted from their speeches, or what other cases could have been better or included as well as what they've already have. You can save all of those additional comments and tips, I would say, for personal feedback when they approach you after the debate. The OA should only refer to and analyze the material that was spoken in the round without an ideation of what you wanted to see on top of that. That's feedback you can give them happily after the round's over. Finally, some general common mistakes that you can sometimes fall trap to in not just Asian parliamentary debating, but Asian parliamentary judging, but debate judging in general. The first is preferring practical or consequentialist arguments over principled arguments. So practical arguments are not automatically better or more weighted than principled arguments. You ought to assess them to the same extent as you would a practical argument, because the type of argument does not automatically confer any value to it. So ask yourself whether a principled or a practical argument has been analyzed to the fullest extent. Has it been proven true? Has it been impacted or weighed? Has it been connected in relevance to the discussion that we're having, to the interests of the actors, etc.? So you assess it to the same extent. So if a principled argument happens to be proven and impacted better than a practical argument, that can take over the practical argument depending on how the debate goes. Secondly, you should not let yourself assess arguments based on your own ideological bias. So common impacts that we personally think are good and innate benefits to the world might not always be the case in the world of debate. So having more money is not always a good thing, to the same extent that proving right-leaning policies happen is not a bad thing in debates. It is the burden of teams to explain to you why having more money is a good thing, maybe because you can buy more things and therefore have a better quality of life, but at the same time also explain why right-leaning policies are not always bad. For example, conservative economic policies sometimes can be good for the country, depending on the type of industries it has, etc. So you ought not take an impact at face value and ascribe its benefit or harm based on your preference, but rather let it be the burden of the teams to explain why it is a benefit or a harm. Lastly, you ought not step into the debate with your own weighing metric. You should assess the debate in order according to 4 levels of weighing. The first is team's explicit weighing. So, for example, a team explicitly weighs the round based on vulnerability or scale. That, as an agreed metric by the other team, is therefore the metric you should adjudicate the debate on: who proves scale or vulnerability in order to win the round. If there's no explicit weighing, you then default to implicit weighing. Maybe a team does not argue for scale explicitly, but all of the arguments they do suggest imply a direction towards saving the most lives, which is a metric of scale, and therefore that's what the debate is adjudicated on. If that's not present, then you should then default to any metric that's been successfully proven true. So even if a metric was not implicitly or sort of hidden throughout the speeches, you can derive the fact that arguments are pointing towards quality of life or individual happiness, etc. And if that was proven true in that speech or that case given by the team, you therefore can use that as the metric of the debate. If none of these three in order have been delivered in the round, you then, as a last resort, default to what the OIV would believe to be the most important metric. So OIVs generally believe that human life is valuable and therefore is something you can adjudicate the debate on. But as a important reminder, that is a last resort. You ought to default to the material said by speakers in the round first before you consider defaulting to what you think an OIV would consider important, because that does take some level of subjective interpretation of what you think an OIV does value. And in all cases, we want to try and rely on material in the round first before that. One more is arbitrarily assessing analytical rigor. So that's probably the most subjective part of judging in terms of how you assess the strength of rigor or the strength of an argument, etc., in comparison to another argument. So you ought assess rigor according to its logical and intellectual value, which, although can be subjective, does not always look like the following things. So rigor is not always having more mechanisms than another team. If your mechanisms all don't make sense or illogical, that does not mean you have more rigor. It again relies on the logical and intellectual value of your arguments. It's also not having more examples or more flamboyant language or more facts than the other team. Although these components can help the persuasiveness and overall conviction of your arguments, they don't always provide rigor in the way that the speech sometimes requires. So it does depend on how the speaker utilizes these components to their advantage. If they're using an example of a real life scenario that supplements the core idea that they're trying to present, that is a form of analytical rigor. But if the case only relies on examples without any additional analysis of logic or structural reason or mechanisms, then that does not automatically mean the examples given constitutes sufficient rigor to prove a claim. So while these claims and elements can support the rigor of your argument, they ought not to be taken as face value the criteria necessary for having good rigor. Again, it is a holistic adjudication of mechanisms, logic, intellectual value, strength, etc., and how the speaker uses all of these things to their advantage. So in a nutshell, exercise subjectivity with caution and interrogate whether a claim does have intellectual or logical value before automatically crediting it. That's all for our judge briefing. Again, it was meant to be fast and succinct. If you have any questions, you are free to clarify those with reference to the UADC judge manual linked in the description, or if you want to go further for British Parliamentary, you can also look at the world's manuals also linked in the description below. Thank you.